Hello guys, welcome back to my channel and enjoy this fanfic part 1. Now let's start the fanfic. A refreshing, cool breeze blew through an open window, stirring one of the inhabitants in the room from their sleep. Naruto's eyes slowly opened to the familiar setting of his room. Sitting up on the bed, Naruto brushed his crimson hair out of the way of his eyes as he let out a sigh. It was a Monday again, so he had to go to the academy. At least he got to spend the day with Satsuki-chan again. Thankfully it was still relatively early in the morning, so he didn't have to worry about being late to the academy. He still had to get his out of bed. Begrudgingly, Naruto got out of bed but heard a groan behind him. Naruto turned around, and his violet eyes landed on the sleeping form of his mother. She must have reached out to grab him in her sleep, he summarized. This was quite the regular occurrence in his life. She had probably come home from a mission and collapsed on his bed with her Anbu uniform still on, like usual. For as long as he could remember, it had just been him and his mother. She was constantly working to provide for him, and when she wasn't working, she was either fawning over him or sleeping. Though, recently she had taken to training him. Probably because he was the heir to the Uzumaki clan. Though he and his mother were the last members of the Uzumaki, at least that they knew of. He was very thankful for her doing everything she could for him. She was, without a doubt, the most gorgeous woman in the village. He'd seen the stares from literally every man they walked past. He hated how they stared at her. He could see why though, she was the epitome of feminine beauty. Even asleep, she had a serene expression on her face. She had never worn makeup, and she probably never had to. She had plump, full, red lips, rosy cheeks, along with her pale, unblemished creamy skin that glowed. Her looks, coupled with her long flowing crimson hair and shapely body, made her one of, if not the most desirable woman in all of Konoha. She must have known that literally, every man was staring at her whenever she was near them. She could have had any one of them, and they would have accepted her without a second thought. Though, his headstrong mother didn't care for them when he had asked her if their stares bothered her. "You're the only man in the world that I care about, and that's a promise," is what she had told him. That had driven away any insecurities he had of her leaving him. When an Uzumaki makes a promise, they keep it for life. That day he had promised to himself that he would take care of her every need. No matter what it was, he'd fulfill them. For now, he had to get stronger. Strong enough to protect her or his friend Satsuki and her family should the need arise. Even the strongest people needed protection sometimes. Naruto kissed his mother on her head and got dressed for the day. He wore his favorite blue pants, a gray shirt with his clan's symbol displayed proudly on his back, along with a pair of black ninja sandals. He made sure to make some breakfast for his mother before he left. He hated being a burden. The streets of Konoha were relatively the same as they had always been for him. People were beginning to get ready for the upcoming day, which was typical, but he was still confused. Why were they glaring at him? They lusted after his mother but despised him. He'd never understand these people, nor did he care to. He just ignored their glares and moved on. Why should he care about what people, who had no connection to him, thought of him? Maybe he would have if he was all alone and attention-seeking, but he wasn't. He had a couple of people who cared. That was more than enough for him. It wasn't long before he was in front of the academy. Even at an institution like this, he experienced some hatred from the teachers. One of them even tried to prevent him from joining the academy altogether. That teacher was dealt with by his furious mother. She quite simply beat the shit out of the man. A trio of women walking up to him snapped him out of his thoughts. All three of them had hair as black as midnight and eyes colored charcoal. The tallest of the three definitely caught everyone's attention, just like his mother. "How are you doing today, Naruto-kun?" said the eldest of the black-haired women as she kneeled down to his height and ruffled his crimson hair. "I'm doing all right today. How about you, Mikoto-san?" Naruto asked as he stared up at the raven beauty. Mikoto Uchiha was probably the only woman in Konoha who radiated the same beauty as Kushina Uzumaki. Like his mother, she had pale, creamy, unblemished skin. A pair of charcoal-colored eyes that one could lose themselves in. She had straight black hair with bangs that framed both sides of her face. To Naruto, she was basically his aunt in all but blood. "You didn't call me what I've been telling you to call me," Mikoto said with a pout on her face as she pinched his whiskered cheek. "I'm doing fine, Mikoto-chan," Naruto said, followed by him letting out a sigh. Konoha really was full of strange people. "That's more like it," Mikoto said with a smile that would make a normal man's heart skip a beat. Naruto just smiled softly back as he rubbed his cheek. "Now, where's that other troublesome redhead?" Mikoto said as she looked around. "She's asleep at home," Naruto replied with a shrug. He was old enough to walk himself to the academy. Naruto proceeded to tune out Mikoto as she ranted about the stupid red-hot habanero. "Can I go home now?" one of the girls beside Mikoto asked with a rather cold tone. Where Mikoto had warm, caring eyes. Her daughter beside her had an icy, uncaring look. Naruto always felt like she didn't like him all that much. "Azane, you didn't even say hello," Mikoto said with a frown as she turned to her eldest child. "I'll see both of you at home. Good luck at school, Imouto," Azane said with a tinge of warmth in her voice as she looked at her younger sister. "Will you train me when I get home?" Satsuki asked with a voice full of excitement. "Maybe," Azane said as the fringes of a smile appeared on her neutral face. "Azane," Mikoto said with a warning tone that went ignored by her daughter, who began walking off. "I'm sorry Naruto-kun, I think the stress of her job is getting to her." The way Mikoto said that last part was a red flag for Naruto. He had a sixth sense for knowing how people felt. Azane had always been a puzzle to him. She acted cold and ignored him most of the time. Though he never really felt much from her at all, sometimes she seemed happy to see him. Maybe it was all just a facade from her. "It's alright. Satsuki mentioned that she has a hefty workload. Tell her I said to take it easy." Not that she'd listen, Naruto replied with a smile as Mikoto giggled at him. "What? You're nothing like your mother was when she was your age," Mikoto said as she held a hand in front of her mouth to hide her smile. "Is that a good or bad thing?" Naruto asked, not entirely sure how he felt about that. "We'll have to see about that," Mikoto said, giggling again as she didn't bother to try and hide the smile on her face. Seeing the matriarch of the stoic Uchiha clan laughing and smiling garnered the attention of most of the people standing close by. Though most people saw that the person she was showing affection to was Naruto, they all turned away. It didn't bother Naruto in the slightest, but judging by the way Mikoto's fully matured Sharingan sprang to life, she was moderately pissed off. "Are you okay, Mikoto-chan?" Naruto asked as he waved a hand in front of her face. It was quite a breathtaking spectacle for Naruto to see those famous crimson orbs up close, but he could feel the anger wafting off of her. The raven-haired woman took in a couple deep breaths, her bountiful chest rising up and coming back down slowly. A smile made its way back onto her face as she looked at him again. "I'll be fine if you keep calling me that," Mikoto said as she kissed Naruto on the head just as a bell rang. "Satsuki-chan, make sure Naruto-kun doesn't cause any trouble. Oh, and we're spending the night at Naruto-kun's, so just come over after school. I have all your clothes with me already. What about my training with Nei-chan?" Satsuki asked with a pout. I'll get Kushina-chan to train you for tonight, Mikoto told her youngest daughter, who continued pouting. Naruto and Satsuki waved to Mikoto as they ran into the academy. Once he got inside, his face became solemn again. He didn't particularly like the idea of the academy. Most of the students here, except for some, mainly the children from other clans, became ninja just because they thought it was some easy job. They read about the history and thought they could become a hero. Well, the ninja world wasn't so forgiving. It didn't care if you were a child or a fully grown man. You died all the same. Then there were the fangirls and fanboys. They were the worst, and usually, they were the very first people to die. That is if they somehow became a genin. All in all, he felt like this school was somewhat of a fraud. The senseis taught you 3 basic jutsu and nothing else. It's almost like they wanted them to die once they got their first real test of combat. Thankfully his mother had been training him long before he started the academy. Their classroom was already filling up with ninja aspirants. A majority of them were civilians. Though, there were several clan members, which surprised him somewhat. The typical silent Abrum, an Akamichi who was constantly stuffing his face. A Hyuga girl that kept to herself. A rowdy Inuzuka and his stinky mutt. The average lazy Nara. Then there was the fangirl Yamanaka. Yeah, this class was interesting, to say the least. Don't go to sleep like you usually do, Naruto-kun, Satsuki said as she pinched Naruto's arm. I won't, Naruto replied as he leaned back in his chair. You're lying, Satsuki said as she frowned at him. Wake me up if he actually starts teaching us something we don't know. Kushina tossed and turned in her son's bed as her eyes snapped open. She let out a sigh as she ran a hand through her long crimson hair. Grabbing her son's pillow, she hugged it against her body as she took deep breaths. Her mind had replayed the same nightmare it always did. She was in that damned forest again, the 9 tails roaring viciously at her as she called upon every fiber of her being to restrain the colossal beast. Her chains were strong, but God, she felt so weak. Who could blame her? Giving birth to her adorable little red-headed son was the best moment of her life, hands down. Just seeing his little whiskered face made it all worth it. Though, that memory was soon soiled after that masked man arrived. Things had spiraled out of control from there. Not an hour later, the Kyuubi had been extracted from her. Now usually, when a tailed beast was released from a Jinchuriki's seal, they died. It was a miracle she was alive with how the man brute forced the Kyuubi out from the seal. The pain was indescribable, but she pushed through, barely. The Kyuubi was rampaging through the village when Minato had rescued her from the masked man. She couldn't describe the joy and relief she felt when she laid eyes on her little Naruto. Minato was gone in the next minute, having left to fight that masked man she assumed. She just laid by her baby and hummed to him. His little fingers wrapped around her finger as she giggled. God, she wished she could stay with him forever, but she knew that probably wasn't going to happen. For now, Kushina would treasure what little time she had with her red maelstrom. She couldn't hold back the gasp from escaping her lips when Naruto's eyes opened. Just seeing his little tufts of red hair and violet orbs staring up at her almost made her want to cry. She always wanted her kid to have her colorings. Good things never lasted for long, and today definitely wasn't her day. Minato had come back to ask her to help seal the Kyuubi. She was hesitant. She wanted to live and see her son grow up. If she tried to reseal the Kyuubi in her current state, she would probably die. She wasn't too keen on killing herself doing that, even more so now that she had a son to live for. So, when Minato had asked her to help him seal half of the Kyuubi away into their son, she was absolutely furious. The life of a Jinchuriki wasn't a life she wanted her son to experience. With neither of his parents alive to help nurture and guide him, she could only imagine how lonely and painful that life would be. Regardless of her protests, they went along with his plan anyway, not that she wanted to. Though, she wasn't just going to sit back and let Minato do what he pleased with her baby boy. Just as she went to seal away the entirety of the Kyuubi within her and die, Minato activated the Reaper Death Seal, one of her clan's most secret sealing techniques. She knew exactly how the technique worked. After all, she was the one who taught it to that bastard. Minato Namikaze could have sealed away the entire Biju and spared their son from the life of a Jinchuriki, but he didn't. No, he had to seal the young half of it into their son and sentence him to the dreaded life of a Jinchuriki. He knew how the Jinchuriki were treated and still went through with it. If it hadn't been for Tsunade and her enhanced healing factor, Naruto's life would be even more miserable. A sad smile made its way onto Kushina's face as she thought of Naruto. He was much more different than she imagined he would be. She tried to be in his life as much as she could, but her duties in the village took up most of her time. She had expected Naruto to make a fuss about her being gone so much, to act rebellious towards her or push her away, but he didn't do any of that. No, he understood what she was doing and took it in stride. He was only 10 years old, and he was already so independent. Honestly, it terrified her with how closed off he was. He never told her about any of his issues. Hell, the only time she knew something was off with him is when he failed an exam of something she taught him. That's when she found out that one of his teachers was attempting to sabotage him. Kushina felt her anger surge at the mere thought of that worm. She had made an example of that man for all of the village. With her son, and you'd have one very pissed off Uzumaki mother to deal with. The barriers around her residence alerted her to the entrance of a keyed individual coming. Setting Naruto's pillow back onto his bed, Kushina stood up and straightened out her clothes as she walked down the staircase to meet Mikoto. The smell of breakfast hit her senses as she rushed down. Someone's in a hurry, her best friend said as she placed a plate full of food in front of her. I haven't had anything to eat for a while. Since I've been helping your clan out with that seal. Kushina replied before spooning a mouthful of eggs into her mouth. She never knew eggs could get so fluffy if you cooked them the right way. Sorry about that. The Hyuga clan has been hounding us for not making a seal that prevents our dojutsu from being taken, Mikoto said with an awkward laugh. Then her bestie took a mouthful of eggs before covering her mouth. When did Naruto-kun get so good at cooking? Mikoto asked as she swallowed the mouthful. He's always been good at cooking. I guess he just went the extra mile today, Kushina said with a sad expression. She knew the only reason Naruto was remotely good at cooking was that she was gone so often, so he had to make his own meals. I'm sorry you have to work on that seal. I know you've been wanting to spend more time with Naruto-kun, Mikoto genuinely apologized. Kushina just waved off her best friend's apology. She knew that this was going to come around eventually. The seal wasn't exactly complicated to make. It just prevented the person with the seal from having or creating kids without their consent. There was also an additional part of the seal. If the user died, the Sharingan would be sealed off to prevent individuals from taking them. Without the key that was currently in her possession, the famed dojutsu was safe and secure. It's fine. Just juggling all of that along with my regular duties is a little taxing, Kushina said as she took a sip of orange juice. Minato and her had saved up money to take care of Naruto, but there was only so much. Both she and Minato had saved up money to help raise Naruto, but after the Kyuubi incident, along with now being a single parent, she spared no expense in raising Naruto. Obviously, funds ran out fast, and she needed to get more to take care of her baby boy. Being an Uzumaki, she was naturally adept at fuinjutsu. She enlisted into the sealing team of the Anbu and soon rose to become their leader. Probably the worst decision she had ever made. Sure, she was getting a ton more money, but now, she had little to no time to spend with Naruto. Why don't you try asking the Hokage to take some time off? Mikoto suggested, taking hold of Kushina's free hand and giving it a squeeze. I don't think that monkey wants me to take any time off, Kushina bitterly remarked. Sometimes it felt like he was working her to the bone just so she wasn't home. Anyhow, enough about my issues. How are things with you and Fugaku? Kushina, I'm here for you. You know that. Talk to me, Mikoto said, giving her hand a firm squeeze. Kushina just shook her head, looking her best friend in the eyes. She put up the best smile she could before she spoke. I'm fine, Mikoto, really I am. The look in the blacket's eyes told her she wasn't convinced. Mikoto let out a frustrated sigh, causing her to raise an eyebrow. Are things really that bad between the two of you? Kushina asked, somewhat surprised. As far as she knew, Mikoto and her husband had a good relationship. I guess, ever since the Kyuubi's attack, along with your statement about the person with the Sharingan who attacked you. Sorry about that, Mikoto said as she ran her hands through her black hair. It wasn't your fault, so don't apologize, Kushina gently said. Both of them seemed to have a ton on their plate. She needed to be a pillar of strength for her friend, just as Mikoto was for her. The Uchiha that had attacked her had probably been killed by Minato anyways. Though, when the ninja had searched the area, she had reported. They said no one was there. She made sure to be very descriptive in her report of the man's ability to become intangible and teleport. Now that she thought of it, she had never told Mikoto about the person who had attacked her. The Uchiha clan has been under a lot of scrutiny after the attack. Fugaku even reported that an Uchiha was missing during the attack, so that hasn't made things any better for us. The Hokage had even asked him to have a Yamanaka search through his mind, Mikoto continued, fiddling with her hair. Then there's Azane. She and Shisui were like best friends. It was good for her to have a normal friend. After he died, Azane hasn't been the same. The Uchiha matriarch looked like she was ready to break down at this point. Kushina couldn't stand seeing Mikoto like this. Standing up, she rushed to her friend's side and hugged her. I just want my girls to be happy. I should have never agreed to let Azane join the Anbu, Mikoto said, crying into Kushina's stomach. Kushina just hugged her friend even tighter and rubbed her back soothingly. She whispered words of encouragement to her childhood friend to try and help her through what she was experiencing. After around 10 minutes, Mikoto had finally calmed down somewhat. You can't blame yourself for everything, Miko-chan, Kushina said, using Mikoto's childhood nickname. You're a great mother, and we all know it. Mikoto didn't reply verbally, but she nodded her head. Everything will be alright, Kushina said, resting her head on Mikoto's. She hoped everything would be alright, but in a cruel world like this. It was a fool's hope. Naruto woke up to someone shaking him. Letting out a sound of disapproval, he looked up at the person responsible and nearly groaned. Satsuki Ing Uchiha just had to interrupt his nap time. School's over, you know, Satsuki declared, kicking Naruto's shin. Ow, Naruto said, letting out a yawn as he looked around the room. Looking at the clock on the wall, Naruto let out a groan. School ended an hour ago, Naruto irritatedly said. Why didn't you wake me up earlier? Satsuki let out a scoff, not even bothering to look guilty. If anything, she looked content with wasting an hour of their time. That was something she usually never did. He decided not to think about it too much. Uchihas were strange, At least the ones that talked to him were. He was more worried about how his crazy mother was going to react. Sure, she had a seal on his body to monitor where he was, just in case her sensory skills couldn't find him. Knowing her, she was still going to overreact. Naruto stood up out of his chair and left the empty classroom as Satsuki followed closely behind him. The sun was already setting over Konoha once they exited the academy. Some shops were already closing down for the night, and the street was relatively empty. Even as Naruto minded his own business and walked past the villagers. They glared at him and made some remarks that he didn't bother listening to. He felt a hand lace his own as Satsuki stepped up beside him. She was glaring at all of the villagers. "Thanks, Satsuki-chan," Naruto said as she tightened her grip. "Why do they glare at you like that?" Satsuki asked with a frown, her voice a mixture of anger and confusion. "You've done nothing to them." "I'm not sure. You know the villagers have always been like that," Naruto said, shrugging off the glares. At first, they bothered him, but now, after having endured them for so long, it was like water off a duck's back. Though today was going to be a little different, Naruto would soon find out. A man smelling of alcohol came stumbling out of an alleyway. The hairs on Naruto's neck stood up as soon as he saw the man. He could feel the man's rage and anger permeating the air as he looked at him. "You demon," the man slurred out as he charged at Naruto with a knife. Pushing Satsuki behind him, Naruto took up the stance his mother had taught him and waited for the drunkard to get to him. Even if the man was bigger, he had chakra along with training. It didn't hurt to be cautious. Underestimating your enemy in any situation could prove fatal. The man swung his dagger in an overhead arc as Naruto's mind raced. Despite his initial bravado and the training, his feet were frozen. Fear clouded his mind as the blade inched closer and closer to him. Memories of earlier this day flashed before his eyes as the blade was just a foot away now. How he wishes he could have spent more time with his mom, been a better son for her. Now, it didn't seem like he was going to get that chance. Naruto felt something rush through his veins. Whether it was adrenaline or not, he couldn't tell. All he knew was that he didn't want to die. It'd make all the people that were important to him sad. Feeling something deep inside him well up, Naruto brought his arm up faster than he thought he could. He didn't know what made him do it, but he shut his eyes and swiped at the man's wrist. A pained cry erupted throughout the streets as Naruto felt something warm splatter over him. Snapping his eyes open, he saw the man's offending appendage missing, blood spurting out from where his hand had been. His eyes widened as he looked down at his arm. There was a golden, gleaming blade that definitely wasn't there before. The blade itself was around 2 inches away from Naruto's arm. It began at his elbow and went all the way up to his wrist. A sudden red blur caught everyone's attention, followed by what felt like a tornado slamming into the street. Ing! Relief washed over Naruto once he heard his mother's voice. The golden blade on his arm disappeared as he fell to his knees. In the very next moment, his mother was at his side. "Are you both okay? Did he do anything to either of you?" Kushina frantically said. She was looking over every inch of his body, trying to find any injuries. I'm fine," Naruto answered with quickened breath. His heart was still racing as his mind replayed what had just happened. "Kami, I'm glad I made it in time, Databane," Kushina said as she picked him up and kissed him on the forehead. Naruto latched onto his mother like a lifeline as she hugged him even harder. "Come here, honey." Naruto felt Satsuki beside him as Kushina wrapped them in her warm embrace. He could feel his mother's unease as a group soon formed around them. In one swift moment, Kushina had swept both him and Satsuki onto the rooftops as she leapt from roof to roof. It wasn't long before they were back home, within the safety of the barrier. Kushina pushed open the front door and sat them down on the couch. The safety and security of being at home helped put him at ease somewhat. He felt Satsuki shivering beside him as he heard someone running down the stairs. Satsuki! Mikoto yelled as she rushed into the living room. The blanket was at her daughter's side at a moment's notice. What happened? Mikoto asked, looking at Kushina beside her. Someone attacked them, Kushina said, her violet eyes still staring at Naruto. Naruto just stared back at her before looking at her arm. He noticed Kushina followed his gaze. She had to have seen the blade on his arm when she had come. His mind was still boggled. As he thought about what had just happened more and more, he could feel his anxiety building up. The realization that one of the villagers that had despised him so much actually tried to take his life. His hands grasped at his pants as they began to shake. Why was he so weak? He had been training for years now to become a ninja. Yet here he was, a mere drunk civilian had nearly taken his life. He knew they hated him, but he never expected something like this to happen to him. The rational part of his mind knew it was only a matter of time before something like this did happen. Naruto had expected that he'd actually be able to put up a fight. Here he was with reality thrust upon him. He froze and had nearly met his end if not for his body moving on its own and the swift intervention of his mother. He was nothing but a burden again. Even now, he felt his mother's hand over his as he gripped at his pants. He wanted to be better, to be the one taking care of her. Yet here he was, nothing more than a crying child. The moon was high in the sky when Naruto's eyes opened. He found himself entrapped in his mother's embrace once again. Though, unlike before, his mind was plagued with the events that transpired earlier in the day. A bead of sweat raced down Naruto's forehead as it felt like the room was heating up. He did his best to calm his racing heart as the vivid memory seemingly played on repeat. Managing to slip out of Kushina's grasp, he quickly walked into the kitchen and got a cup of water. The cooling sensation from drinking it helped, but it wasn't enough. Refilling the cup, Naruto took it and went outside. The brisk night air greeted him as he felt his body and mind calm down. He sat down on the chill wood and breathed in deeply. Looking up, Naruto saw the full moon blazing over Konoha. He had heard that on the day of a full moon, people had acted more aggressively or out of character. It was something he wouldn't nor had paid any mind to. Trying to rationalize the fact that one of the people who had despised him attempting to kill him with superstitious bullshit like that was stupid. Sitting the cup down, Naruto took his face into his hands. Had his life really made him this soft? He had thought that since his mother was busy working all the time that he'd be able to take care of himself. Only for reality to remind him he was nothing but a child with 2 years of physical training under his belt. Come tomorrow, he'd ask his mother to actually train him as a shinobi. To become someone that could be relied upon should the need arise instead of floundering. Sensing someone who was filled with intense feelings of self-loathing and dread, Naruto looked up. Azane-san, Naruto confusedly said as he looked at the woman in question. Azane was still dressed in her Anbu uniform as she stood a couple of feet away from him. The fact she was still dressed in her uniform bewildered him, but it was more or less the feeling he felt wafting off of her. Naruto-kun, Azane said, her voice cracking towards the end, puzzling Naruto even more. The Ravenet walked over to him and sat down beside him. A brisk gust of wind hit both of them as Naruto bore witness to the beautiful woman beside him. Her midnight-colored hair fluttered as it wasn't restrained by the headband that was currently in her hand. Azane's usual, cold onyx eyes were gazing at him as a sad smile came onto her face. Did you just call me Naruto-kun? Naruto asked, his mind finally catching up to what she said. This ice princess was actually referring to him rather fondly, something she'd never done before. I guess I've been a little cold to you, huh? Azane said, that smile on her beautiful face dimming somewhat. Naruto felt her depressive mood worsen as Azane turned her face away and looked up at the moon. It was strange seeing the stoic Uchiha act like his. He was so used to seeing her being impassive to everything. We've both had a rough day, huh? Naruto said as he followed Azane's gaze. Isn't that the truth? Azane said. Her impassive voice was choked up as she rubbed her face. What happened to you? Well, someone tried to kill me, Naruto responded. While he still felt distraught about what happened, it felt like his issues were minute compared to hers. What? Azane said. Her voice sounded like a snarl as she turned to look at him. Naruto froze somewhat. Azane's Sharingan stared into his soul. The gloomy look on her face was replaced with one of fury. For the briefest of moments, he saw what he assumed was a different version or mutation of the Sharingan. In both of her once onyx eyes, there was now a three-bladed pinwheel spinning extremely fast. Those blood-red eyes looked over his entire body before they slowed down and reverted back to her onyx eyes. At least you're safe, Azane began as she let out a sigh. You know how dangerous our life is, Naruto-kun. This won't be the last time someone tries to take your life. You'll need to be strong if you walk down this path, even stronger if you want to protect those around you, Azane finished as he felt her rage dissipate into self-loathing once more. Is that how you're so strong? Naruto asked as Azane wrapped an arm around him and him closer to her. I wouldn't say I'm strong. A strong person can persevere and protect through anything, come hell or high water, Azane said. Her voice sounded bitter to Naruto. For the life of him, he couldn't understand what was going on with her. I promise to become strong then. Strong enough to protect you and our families, Naruto determinedly said, looking at the Ravenet beside him. Don't make a girl a promise if you know you can't keep it, Azane said with a smile as she poked his forehead. Nay-san. Naruto felt Azane tense up once they heard Satsuki's voice. The feelings he felt from Azane earlier became more intense, especially the feeling of dread. The older of the Uchiha sisters let out a sigh as she stood up from beside him. The look on her face returned to its impassive one, but inside, he knew she was in emotional turmoil. The next few moments for Naruto would feel like an eternity as he saw the look on Satsuki's face morph from looking happy to one of immense pain. Satsuki let out a scream, surely waking both his mother and Mikoto as she collapsed onto the ground. He was immediately at his friend's side. Satsuki was writhing on the wood floor as Naruto did his best to hold her still. Aizen, Naruto began as he looked at Azane. Tears were streaming down Azane's face as she closed one of her eyes. A look of pure regret was splayed all over her face. In the next moment, she was gone in a gust of wind. What happened? Kushina yelled as she rushed outside. Azane did this, Naruto said. He was just having a normal conversation with her, and she did this. It didn't feel like she wanted to do this, so why would she? Mikoto and Kushina were doing whatever they could to help Satsuki as she thrashed around in pain. Satsuki's eyes flickered open for a moment, allowing all three of them to see her single Tomo Sharingans erratically spinning before she lost consciousness. Mikoto had swept up Satsuki from the ground as she leapt away to presumably take her daughter to the hospital. Stay here, Naruto, Kushina said with a stern voice as she summoned a clone and quickly followed after her friend. Kushina's clone quickly led Naruto back into the house as the clone set out to adjust the barrier around their home. He felt lightheaded as he collapsed onto the sofa behind him. His mind was a blur at this point as he tried to take in everything that had happened that day. To think it had been such a regular day and it had turned to such chaos. The moon was high in the sky as its rays of light illuminated the forest below. A black blur could be spotted jumping from tree to tree. Said blur stopped on a branch as they looked up at the moon above. "I'm so sorry, Satsuki-chan," Ka-san, Azane thought as her blood-red eyes looked into the sky above. Dark gray clouds were fast approaching. The telltale signs of a storm were there as a loud crack of thunder echoed throughout the forest. Azane's Sharingan could spot the streaks of lightning in the sky as it began to rain. Tears began streaming down her face as she recalled what she had done earlier. She started jumping from tree to tree. Her accursed clan's gift was replaying the memories of earlier that evening over and over in her mind. Azane could feel her hands begin to shake before she clenched them into fists. Her hands were already stained with the blood of her enemies. Though, now she could add her family to that. It felt like her soul was tainted now as she attempted to flush the memories from her mind. There were so many things the Ravenet wanted to do. She ached to curl up into a ball and cry her heart out. She wanted to hug her younger sister and mother and tell them she was sorry. She wanted to preserve the fragile peace the elemental nations had, so she slaughtered her entire clan. Now she could seek out any of her aspirations. Coming to a steep cliff face, Azane stopped as she looked down the dark abyss. The rain had absolutely drenched her clothing as her Anbu outfit clung to her lithe body. She could feel her black hair that framed her face stick to her face as droplets of water ran down her tresses. Taking a step off the edge, she found herself plunging into the abyss. The air rushing past her face chilled the cold rain even more as she ignored the bitter cold seeping into her bones. This unjust world had forced her to kill her clan. She didn't have a choice. Her family would have revolved, starting a full-blown civil war which would have caused another great war. She found herself juggling the deaths of around 150 people to thousands of people dying. The option was hers and hers alone to make. At least with the first option, she was able to negotiate with the third Hokage to ensure the safety of her mother and sister. War had been avoided with the deaths of her entire clan. Her direct family was safe. Though, now she was labeled an S-rank missing nin. All of this at the mere age of 15 years old. If only she had more time, maybe she could have found a way to avoid all of the senseless bloodshed. Regrettably, time was a commodity she didn't have. She told herself multiple times that this was the best possible outcome. Though, she couldn't even force herself to believe that. With the Uchiha clan now gone, there was a massive power vacuum left in its wake. She was sure the Hyuga clan would make a power grab. A pang of guilt and regret hit her soul as she stabbed a kunai into the side of the cliff face to slow her descent. The despicable CRA was surely going to be enacted on a couple of people. Kushina, Tsunade, and Naruto would surely be the poor first three to have the act forced upon them. Kushina and Tsunade would probably just tell them to off, though it would still weigh in on them. Some repercussions were instituted if you didn't comply with the act. The most basic of it started with a simple increase in taxes on your goods, and it increased with every month. Eventually, it'd get to the point where you couldn't afford anything, and that left the person with two options. You either marry someone or attempt to escape the village. Azane quickly cut off that train of thought. She didn't want to think of what would happen to them because of her actions. So, she began thinking of something else. Specifically a person. Naruto Uzumaki. She could see so much of herself in him, but he was different. The embers of greatness were within him. She knew that he'd accomplish so much, hopefully, good things. All he needed was a push. She was placing her faith in Naruto to protect her family along with his own. Kushina and Tsunade had both been her role models, along with Mikoto. She never wanted to put them in a situation like this. It was a hell of a burden to put on the shoulders of a 10-year-old, but she was sure he'd persevere. She just hoped that Naruto was just as unpredictable as his mother. Then there was her sister, Kami. She had tortured her with the use of her Tsukiyomi. Satsuki was probably scarred for life because of negligence. She was just trying to help. Within the Tsukiyomi she had inflicted on Satsuki, she had left subtle messages for her. Her little sister would remember it thanks to her Sharingan activating and memorizing every detail. Satsuki would likely hate her for the rest of their lives, but she just wanted to make sure she knew the reason behind their clan's demise. It was only for the worst-case scenario in which she died before Satsuki could find out. Though, the turbulent world they lived in always ate up people's plans. Azane couldn't recall how long she had spent in the gorge as she stared at her reflection in the running water. The illuminating beams of light from the moon could hardly reach her down here. Though that mattered not, thanks to these cursed eyes, she could see everything clearly. "You're late," a cold, monotonous voice said from the darkness. Tearing her eyes away from the waterway, Azane wearily regarded the masked man who stepped out from the shadows. She couldn't sense his presence before. It was almost like he materialized from nothing. She did, however, recognize his voice along with his long black hair. The man had helped her earlier that evening in killing her clan. Madara Uchiha, in the flesh, stood before her. The name alone was enough to send shivers down her spine. There was a reason he was still feared throughout the elemental nations. There were complications, Azane muttered out as she thought of her two teammates she had killed. It was more of an excuse, though she was sure the man saw right through her lie. She wasn't going to tell him that she had paused on her journey here multiple times to keep herself from breaking down. Though, she couldn't gauge the man's reaction due to his burnt orange mask. All she could see was the lone Sharingan eye staring back at her. Madara didn't bother saying anything as he walked past her down the stream. Azane followed after the stoic man as she kept her thoughts to a minimum. In but a few moments, she spotted a small boat pulled up onto the ground beside the waterway. She raised an eyebrow at Madara climbing into the boat but didn't say anything as she pushed it into the water. Azane jumped in just before the water began carrying them through the gorge. She felt a pang of loneliness seep into her heart. For the first time in her life, she was well and truly alone now. Kushina let out a sigh as she ran a hand through her crimson locks. Her violet eyes were tracing her best friend, who was pacing back and forth. For the last couple of hours, both she and Mikoto had been sitting in the waiting room. Mikoto's hair was messy, and her eyes were bloodshot. Her usual regal self was nowhere to be found. She looked like an absolute mess right now. She couldn't blame her either. If anything, she found herself sympathizing with her. Both of their clans had practically been wiped from the face of the earth. Though Uzushiogakure had been destroyed by hostile villages. Whereas the Uchiha clan was killed off by none other than one of their members. The redhead could only imagine how her best friend felt right now. Her entire family, except for both of her daughters, were gone. One of which was an S-ranked fugitive, while the other was in critical condition. To think that only a couple of hours ago, everything was going all right. Thanks again, world, for being such an again. Kushina bitterly thought as she began to think of her son. With all the chaos going on, she found herself leaving him home alone, again. Sure, she had a shadow clone watching over him, but it wasn't really her. She could only imagine how he was feeling right now. She had seen the look on her baby boy's face just before she leapt away with Mikoto. Never in her life had she seen the look of betrayal on his face. His violet eyes were full of confusion as she jumped after Mikoto. She just hoped he was okay. Biting her thumb, Kushina shut her eyes as her thoughts continued. She knew how he felt, like he was weighing her down constantly. Like he was some garbage or something. That wasn't the case at all though. If anything, he was the only driving force in her life. Though, she just didn't know how to help him. Whenever she offered to talk to him about his issues, he just blew her off, telling her not to worry. Hell, the only time she did manage to get him to talk, he was vague about his issues. Naruto was oh so stubborn, just like her. Sometimes she wanted to smack him for acting so stupid. Though, she knew he'd probably take that the wrong way. She didn't want him feeling any worse than he already did. The longer she watched Mikoto pace back and forth, the more she found herself longing to be by Naruto. That settled it in Kushina's mind. When she got home, she was going to smother Naruto with love. She knew life was too short to be moping around all the time. Plus, she was tired of seeing him force a smile on his face when she asked if he was okay. Today, she was going to make him feel loved and wanted. Speaking of time, she planned on announcing her retirement from the Anbu to the Hokage later today. Sure, being a Jonin usually meant she got a little less pay. Though that meant she finally got more time to spend with her son. Hearing the door to the operating room open snapped her out of her thoughts as she and Mikoto rushed over to Tsunade. Tsunade was dressed in her typical outfit despite the protests of everyone around her. Her blonde hair was tied into two ponytails as she rubbed her face. Even from a couple feet away, Kushina could see the dark bags under Tsunade's brown eyes. Tsunade looked absolutely exhausted. How is she? Mikoto frantically asked. You could hear the fright in her voice as she locked eyes with Tsunade. Physically, Satsuki is perfectly healthy. I couldn't find an issue with her, Tsunade began as a sympathetic look took form in her eyes. Though, mentally, I'm not sure. Only time will tell, the busty blonde finished as she put a comforting hand on Mikoto's shoulder. We're here for you, Miko-chan, Kushina said with a soothing voice as she embraced her best friend. Kushina felt a stab of sympathy in her heart as she saw tears begin forming in her friend's eyes again. She rubbed soothing motions on Mikoto's back as she thought of the past. She had been in the same position as her years ago. Mikoto had been there for her back then, so she'd be there for her now. Why don't you and Satsuki-chan move in with Naruto and I? Kushina offered. She didn't want Mikoto or Satsuki going back to the Uchiha compound, not after what happened there. Are you sure about that? I don't want us to intrude on either of you, Mikoto asked as she looked up at her. Those charcoal-colored eyes were looking at her with a mixture of hope and relief. I'm sure. Kushina nodded as Mikoto's embrace got even tighter around her. Their embrace was cut short when Tsunade cleared her throat. Mikoto backed away from her as they both looked at the Sannin. How's Naruto doing? Tsunade asked as she locked eyes with her. He fell asleep on the couch a couple of hours ago. Kimiko is watching over him right now, Kushina answered as she felt a pang of guilt hit her in the chest. Tsunade merely just sighed at her. Well, you two can go ahead and head home. When Satsuki wakes up, I'll be sure to escort her to Kushina's house myself, Tsunade said as she smiled at them. Thanks again, Oni-chan, Kushina said as she hugged her surrogate older sister. Anything for my annoying little sister, Tsunade replied as she returned the embrace. Asshole, Kushina muttered, causing the older blonde to laugh as the two broke their embrace after a couple of moments. Come here you, Tsunade said, gesturing towards Mikoto with her open arms. Mikoto was just standing there gingerly as she looked at Tsunade. The Ravenet looked unsure of what to do. Walking up behind her, Kushina gave her a gentle push, causing Mikoto to stumble into Tsunade's hug. Mikoto had always been incredibly reserved when it came to her affections. Before she could escape, Tsunade's arms had already wrapped around her. Just remember that you're not alone in this. You've got Kushi-chan, Naruto, and I here to help you and Satsuki, Tsunade whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. Mikoto stopped trying to escape from Tsunade's grasp as she froze. Kushina smiled at the sight of her surrogate sister figure comforting her best friend. Tsunade definitely wasn't the most polite person. If anything, she was kind of an. Though she did have a sweet spot in her heart for friends and family. It was just like Mito said. Her last name may have been Senju, but she was an Uzumaki, through and through. Thank you both so much, Mikoto muttered with tears streaming down her cheeks as she returned the kind gesture. Life may have beat them down constantly, but she had a feeling that if they were together, they'd always make it back to their feet. Kushina's rising feelings of hope for the future were soon replaced with anxiety when she saw a masked man approaching them. A member of the Anbu confronting anyone after a disaster was never good news. She expected the man to walk over to Mikoto and begin talking to her. Count her surprised and very anxious when the man stopped in front of her. Uzumaki Kushina? The man asked. There were literally only 2 crimson-haired people in Konoha, but she nodded nonetheless. The Hokage has requested your presence. Kushina nodded once more as the man vanished in a flurry of leaves. Looking over at Tsunade and Mikoto, she saw their worried looks. She forced a reassuring smile onto her face despite the anxiety coursing through her veins. Both of them definitely saw through it, but it was worth a shot. A summons from the Hokage after such an event was never good. Despite the bad feelings weighing on her chest, Kushina quickly left the hospital and made her way to the Hokage's tower. Crossing her arms, Kushina made sure to stand up a little straighter before entering the room the Hokage was waiting in. She had already felt on edge when she was coming to the tower. Now that she was in it, those feelings had intensified. Though she didn't want to appear weak, so she did her best to keep calm. Taking in another deep breath, Kushina pushed open the door and walked into the room, and stood before Hiruzen and his advisors. The room itself was rather quaint for the village leaders, but she paid that no mind. May I ask why you've summoned me, Hokage-sama? Kushina asked with an even voice as she bowed her head to Hiruzen. As the current leader of their village, Hiruzen was the only one she'd be showing any respect to. She'd be wary of Danzo because of his reputation. The other 2 were nothing but advisors, so honestly, she couldn't find herself to care for either of them. Hiruzen puffed on his pipe one more time before setting it down and looking her in the eye. Kushina-chan, by now, I'm sure you've heard of the Uchiha clan's demise. Hiruzen asked with a heavy voice. Kushina could have snorted at the question. By now, she was sure it was the talk of all the shinobi with clearance. Hell, she was with the Uchiha matriarch when she got the news. I have, Kushina answered despite knowing that Hiruzen knew the answer to it already. She had sensed the army of Anbu units surrounding the hospital she was just in moments ago. Danzo's remaining eye opened as Kushina felt a surge of apprehension course through her. The only time she'd ever seen the old warhawk pay attention or show any interest was when the subject pertained to Konoha's supremacy. That's when she knew for sure that she wouldn't like what came next. Kushina-chan, Hiruzen began as a heavy sigh escaped him. The old man had a troubled look on his face that she doubted was genuine. You couldn't juggle being a good man along with being the leader of the strongest nation in the world. She had thought Minato was that way. Though on Naruto's birthday, he had proved her wrong. Ever since then, she'd always paid more attention to people to see how they acted. I know you've refused to remarry since Minato's death, but with the Uchiha clan gone, a large chunk of our military forces are gone, the old man continued before she interrupted him. No, Kushina blankly stated as she struggled to not glare at the man. She knew where this charade was going. By no means was she remarrying and pumping out babies for the sake of this village or any village for that matter. Kushina-chan, I only ask that you find love again. The village would prosper with the help of your children, Hiruzen stated, still using his grandfatherly tone. Kushina bit down on her tongue to keep the grimace off of her face. Listening to the Hokage trying to convince her to do this infuriated her. She wasn't going to marry anyone for the rest of her life. It may have been old school or naive of her, but she had thought Minato was the one for her. Though, after seeing how he more than gladly sealed the Kyuubi inside their child, she had lost all faith in him. Thinking about Naruto's sealing again brought up a mixed amount of emotions in her. She should have protested against it more. She should have done something. Though, all she did was follow alone with what Minato had said and helped seal the Kyuubi in her son. If anything, she was as much of a failure to Naruto as Minato was. I love Naruto, Kushina stated as the Hokage only stared at her. I'm sure you've heard of the Clan Restoration Act. Hiruzen asked as he crossed his old fingers. I have, Kushina bitterly answered, no longer able to keep the grimace from appearing on her face. I only want you and Naruto-kun to be happy. That's why I'm giving you time to find a husband of your own choosing, Hiruzen said with a gentle tone. Repulsion, that's all Kushina felt right now as she leveled a glare at Hiruzen. Hiruzen may act all grandfatherly, but he was nothing more than a snake. Hell, the only reason Tobirama must have picked him as his successor was because he was charismatic and not a sociopath. Is this act being enacted on Naruto and I? Kushina asked as she took a deep breath in an attempt to calm the searing anger raging through her veins. It is. Tsunade will also be placed under the act, Homura chimed in from beside Hiruzen. I was asking the Hokage, not you, Kushina snapped at the man. She was no longer in the mood to deal with anyone's shit. Both you and Tsunade will have 5 months to find a suitable partner. Naruto will have 3 months when he becomes of age, Hiruzen said as he glared at Homura. A wave of fury coursed through her as she clenched her fists so tightly she was sure her knuckles were white. Part of her wanted to ask about Satsuki and Mikoto. Though, she quickly shut that part out. It was only petty jealousy. She loved those two like her own family. She was glad that they might be spared from the act. Though, knowing Hiruzen, he'd probably do the same thing to them come a couple of months. With that in mind, Kushina began as she made no attempt to hide the fury in her tone. I resign from the Anbu and any duties tied to it. Hiruzen just stared at her for a long moment. She could tell he was contemplating refusing her demand. Though, after another minute, he nodded in acceptance. Hell, it was the least the old could do. Though, with how the Hokage was acting, she doubted there was any hint of kindness to it. If anything, it was likely a ploy to attempt to keep her loyal to the village. Danzo and Hiruzen had both likely thought out this damned plan. Not only did they plan on resurrecting the Uzumaki clan in Konoha with Naruto and her, they intended to do the same for Tsunade and the Senju. It was only a matter of time, she supposed, but it still infuriated her. With the Uchiha clan at full force, they made up a decent chunk of the military force. Hence why the act hadn't been placed on them earlier. Snakes, Kushina resentfully thought. Will that be all? She asked, her voice full of anger. She was itching to get out of this building. The moment the Hokage nodded, she stormed out of the room and made sure to slam the door as hard as possible. Hearing the hinges shatter brought her a tinge of joy as she hauled down the staircase. She didn't want to set foot in this tower for the rest of her life. Right now, all she wanted to do was vent her anger. She felt the urge to break multiple things. Running a hand through her long crimson hair, she felt tears begin to well up in her eyes. Her initial enthusiasm about rebounding from anything was quickly fading. Kami, what was she going to tell Naruto? Sorry honey, but both of us have to get into a relationship with someone and have tons of children. All for the sake of the Ing village. At this point, she was practically a blur on the rooftops as she headed for a training ground to vent her anger. It wasn't long before she reached the training ground. Walking up to a tree, Kushina punched it with a chakra-enhanced fist. The tree lurched and groaned as it fell. She didn't pay any attention to the falling tree. She was more focused on how or if she broke the news to her baby boy. A gust of wind blew through the field as Kushina shook her head. She wouldn't sugarcoat it for Naruto, not anymore. He was old enough and clever enough to understand the situation. Knowing him, he might even come up with something to help their ailments. She stopped putting any more thought into the act as she started venting her anger out on the training ground. Naruto's eyes fluttered open as the sun peered through his blinds, the beams of light hitting him right in the face. A painful throbbing in his head caused him to clutch at his skull. Looking around, he found himself on his bed. Though looking at the clock, he found that it was already well past noon. Seeing that the day was already practically over, Naruto went to lay his head back. Just as his head hit the pillow, all the memories from last night suddenly found their way into his mind as his eyes widened. He would have jolted out of bed if it wasn't for the hand stopping him from doing so. Looking at the owner of the hand caused him to let out a sigh of relief. Sat beside him was Kimiko Hatake, daughter of the White Fang. The beauty beside him had a flowing mane of silver hair that covered her left eye along with her forehead protector. Her black mask was still in place as she wore her typical Jonin garb. Though her vest was undone, showing off her ample S that were barely restrained by a thin, gray shirt. You're going to kill someone with all that excitement of yours, Kimiko muttered as she expertly flipped to the next page of her book with a single hand. Kimiko nay, Naruto started, causing the silver-haired Jonin to look at him. What happened? He asked as he stared into her lone, coal-colored eye. Well, Azane murdered the entire Uchiha clan besides her mother and sister. She put Satsuki into a genjutsu, so she's at the hospital. Mikoto-sama and Kushina-sama are at the hospital with her last I heard, Kimiko explained as she shut her book closed. Other than Mikoto herself and her daughters, he could care less about the rest of the Uchiha clan. Naruto just let out a sigh as he rubbed his aching head. The vivid memories from last night were still playing in his mind. His conversation with Azane was the most prominent, just before the abrupt ending with Satsuki's blood-curdling scream. Naruto felt his heart drop at that thought. All of Azane's feelings from last night made sense now. Though, why would she do something she didn't want to do? Hearing a thud on the nightstand beside him snapped him out of his trance. Naruto looked over and saw Kimiko placing a book on the nightstand. The title read Ika Ika Volume 4. Ka-chan would murder you if she saw you reading that, Naruto groaned as he rubbed his head again. It felt like the headache was getting worse. Probably. Let me go get you some water, Kimiko said as she left the room. Laying his head back on the pillow, Naruto put an arm over his face to try and block the sun. He hoped Satsuki, Mikoto and Azane were alright. Despite what Azane had done, he still hoped she was at least safe. Part of him wanted to know why Azane did what she did. He could feel all the anguish she was going through as she sat beside him that evening. Though, he doubted he'd find out about that anytime soon. Here, Kimiko's voice said suddenly from beside him as she leaned down to offer him a cup of water. He hadn't even heard her walking around. Silently walking came naturally to her at this point, he summarized. Thanks, Naruto said as he accepted the glass of water and downed it. The cool refreshment helped soothe his headache some, but he'd probably need more. How are you doing? Kimmy softly asked. That lone coal-black eye was looking at him worriedly. I'm fine, Naruto quickly answered. A flick to his nose nearly made him curse as he looked at Kimiko. Despite the mask she had on, he could tell she was smiling at him. Though she was giving him that signature eye smile as well. You know, lying to me or your mother will only get you so far, Kimiko muttered, smile still in place. Are you going to tell me how you're actually feeling, or do I need to flick you again? She asked, as she prepared to flick him once more. Fine, fine, Naruto irritatedly mumbled as he held up a hand to deter the woman. I'm a mess, he simply stated as he put his hand down. Mind going into any details about that? Kimiko asked as she tilted her head at him. Naruto opened his mouth and shut it a couple times as he broke eye contact with Kimiko. He was so used to just bottling it all up inside that actually talking about it was more difficult than he expected. Part of him started falling back on his old habit, just to save him the effort. You don't have to talk about it if it bothers you that much, Kimiko offered as she put a hand on his arm and gave it a gentle squeeze. The sheer sincerity in Kimiko's voice finally wore down his proverbial defense. Kimiko and his mother could always get him to talk. Though, it was just a matter of having the time to do so. Seeing as he was cornered by the woman fretting over him, he let out a sigh. Feeling Kimiko take his hand in hers caused him to look up at her. Her free hand was up by her face as he pulled down her black face mask, revealing her delicate pale features. He'd seen her face plenty of times, but it was only on special occasions. Typically, Kushina was the only one to convince her to take it off for family pictures. She had always been a little different around them, being more open and such. Though, she probably only kept her mask on to keep all the guys from fawning over her. How'd you react the first time someone tried to kill you? Naruto asked as Kimiko narrowed her lone eye at him. I returned the favor, Kimiko honestly answered as her grip on his hand got tighter. Ing froze, Naruto said as a bitter laugh escaped him. Some no name would have killed the heir to the famed Uzumaki clan. All because I hesitated, he nearly shouted out the last part as his frustration started building up. What was the point of all the training he went through if he couldn't even use it to defend himself? He was becoming a ninja, so he could protect the people he loved. How was he supposed to do that when he lacked the resolve to kill a man trying to kill him? Kami knows the next time something like that happened, he wouldn't hesitate. It's different for everyone, Naruto, Kimiko said in an attempt to try and soothe him. How are people supposed to rely on me when we fight an actual ninja? Naruto shouted as he tried to get out of the bed, his hand slipped out from Kimiko's grasp. He didn't feel like being in bed. His blood was boiling as the urge to break something coursed through him. Sit down, Kimiko said in a tone that left no room for argument. Naruto locked eyes with the woman for a moment. He knew arguing or fighting with her wouldn't do any good. So, he begrudgingly sat down on the edge of the bed. No one expects a first year in the academy to kill anyone, Kimiko began as she wrapped her hands around his clenched fist. There's no shame in having someone rescue you. Even the strongest people need to be saved sometimes. I'd rather not be getting rescued all the time, Naruto mumbled as he looked away from Kimiko's alluring face. I just want to become someone that can be relied on when the time comes. And you will be, Kimiko said with a smile as she massaged his fist. What makes you say that? Naruto asked with a raised brow as he turned to meet her gaze again. Well, you have me, your mother, and Mikoto-san all rooting for you, Kimiko replied with a thoughtful look on her face. Then a mischievous smile made its way onto her face in the next second. Plus, there'll be all the training you'll get here in a couple years. Why do we have to wait a couple years? Naruto said as a smile made its way onto his face for the first time today. Training was always something to look forward to. Not only would he get stronger because of it, but he was able to spend time with his family. I thought you'd dread training with me a little more, Kimiko said, pouting at him. Ka-chan can get pretty rough with her training, Naruto deadpanned with a shrug. She can be pretty harsh, can't she? Kimiko reminisced with a fond smile on her face. Kimiko forced him to move over as she sat by him on the bed. The next couple of minutes between them were spent in silence as they just enjoyed each other's company. Actually, talking to someone did make him feel better. Though he wouldn't make this a habit, he would be more open to vent his frustrations. Naruto, no matter how you feel, just know that I'm happy to have a little brother like you, Kimiko said, breaking the silence as she laid a kiss on his head. Before he could reply, Kimiko's stomach rumbled quite loudly, causing her to shyly look away. Let me whip something up for you, Naruto laughed out as he got off of the bed and made his way out of the room. Kimiko's lone eye brightened up at the mention of his cooking as she practically jumped off the bed and followed after him. I'll never understand how your cooking is already so much better than mine, Kimiko said with a pout as she stared at her empty plate. You're the one who taught me how to cook. Plus, it wasn't like it was anything special, Naruto stated as he picked up their empty plates. The meal was a simple pork katsu with shredded cabbage as a side. As Naruto began washing the dishes, his thoughts drifted to his family. He hoped Satsuki and Mikoto were doing all right. Knowing his mother, she was probably worried out of her mind. Hopefully, they'd get home soon. He'd already made extra food for all of them. Your mother is on her way back, Kimiko said, causing him to whirl around to look at her. He half expected to see a smile on her face. Count him confused when he saw the conflicted look on her face. Seeing that look on her face made him feel easy. Naruto figured she'd be relieved when Kushina came back. Though, judging by how the door was practically thrown open, he would soon find out why she had that look on her face. Stupid motherers, Kushina shouted as a table went flying down the entryway. Kushina walked into the dining room. A furious look was on her flustered face as she looked at them. Her gray training pants and orange t-shirt clung to her body. Beads of sweat were running down her face as she let out a huff. She was taking in deep breaths through her nose as she took a seat at the kitchen table. She looked royally pissed off. Acting quickly, Naruto filled up a glass of water and offered it to the furious woman. Thanks, hun, Kushina said with a small smile as she began drinking the chilled water. Naruto could sense the rage and sadness emanating from the woman as he walked up beside her. This wasn't the first time he'd seen her angry or sad, but it was the first time he felt the intensity of these emotions from her. Just seeing her lip quiver and her hands tighten around the glass made him want to hug her. Unlike him, Kushina was rather outspoken with how she felt. To see her trying to hold it was heartbreaking. He had been quite a reserved person for the majority of his life. Starting right now, that was going to change. Kushina confusedly looked up at him as he stood beside her. Leaning down, he wrapped his arms around her and just hugged her. He could feel her confusion morph to happiness as she leaned into the hug. There were still tinges of anger from her, but for now, she mainly just felt happy. You feel any better? Naruto asked, ignoring the drops of sweat seeping into his clothes. I'm still angry, but yeah, somewhat. What's gotten into you? Kushina asked as she tilted her head to look up at him. Her inquisitive violet eyes were gazing into his own violet eyes. Do I need a reason to hug my mother? Naruto asked as Kushina narrowed her eyes at him. Yeah, he wasn't that convincing. Alright, You looked like you needed one, he said, folding underneath her gaze. Thank you, Naruto. I needed that, but I need you to sit down, Kushina said as she let out a frustrated sigh. Naruto could feel the tinges of anger come back full force as he took a seat just opposite of her. To see his overbearing mother, this worked up over something, made him nervous. For her to be like this meant whatever happened was a big deal. Kushina's hands combed through her long red tresses as she let out a deep sigh. You've been taught about the CRA in the academy, right? Kushina asked, not even attempting to sugarcoat what this conversation would entail. From the corner of his eye, Naruto spotted Kimiko tensing up at the mention of the act as she stared wide-eyed at both him and Kushina. Since he was from a clan, of course, he'd know what the CRA was. Though, that didn't mean he wasn't shocked to hear about it. Does this have something to do with Azane? Naruto asked as he clenched his fists. If the CRA was enacted on Kushina, that would mean she'd have to marry someone or be forced to marry. Now, if she chose to marry again of her own volition, he'd be a little upset, but in the end, he just wanted her to be happy. Though, nothing happy ever came from the CRA. I assume Kimiko told you about the Uchiha massacre? Kushina asked as she looked at the silver-haired Jonin. At his nod, she continued. With them gone, Konoha is missing a large chunk of its military force. They want you, Tsunade, and I too, help make up for the deficit, Kushina said through gritted teeth. Hearing a glass shatter behind him, Naruto turned around and spotted Kimiko looking livid as she began pacing around in the kitchen. After everything you've already sacrificed for this village, the elders want to marry you off to some man and make you some breeding cow. Kimiko said with fury lacing her voice. It must have been a cold day in hell for both Kimiko and Kushina to be this angry. Though he was right on board there with them. He may have only been 10 years old, but his mind was racing on ways to avoid them marrying anyone entirely. It's never enough, Kushina said with a heavy voice as he saw tears brimming in her eyes. Why don't we leave the village? Kimiko asked as she looked at the two of them. Just pack up some supplies and just go off the grid. And go where? We'd be hunted down by ninja from both Konoha and other villages when they got news of us leaving, Kushina stated as she closed her eyes. Naruto knew that leaving the village was already a no-go for them. As much as he hated to admit it, he'd just be a liability to them. Then what do we do? I'm not going to stand by while they force you to marry some stupid cunt. Kimiko shouted. Her face was red with anger as she took deep breaths. Just sit down and relax. I'm pissed off too, but we're not going to come up with a good solution if we're just shouting, Kushina said with a surprising amount of restraint. Naruto slowly tuned out the two women as they discussed possible plans. His mind couldn't conjure up any ways to avoid their given situation. Much to his chagrin, right now, all he could do was get stronger. So that maybe in the future they could leave the village if they still wanted to. Though, by then, all of them would have been forced to marry someone. That was something he wanted to avoid entirely, but how would he go about it? Seeing Kushina's defeated face, along with hearing Kimiko let out a series of curses, made his heart throb. That's when an idea hit him. The CRA only required that you marry someone. It didn't specify who you married as long as you had eventually had children. So, the CRA requires you to marry someone, right? Naruto asked. He only wanted confirmation of it. Unfortunately, yes, Kushina answered. She sounded defeated, though he could still see the frustration clearly on her face. And males under the act have to marry a minimum of 4 women, right? Naruto asked once more as he looked at both Kimiko and Kushina. Receiving a nod from both of them, he continued speaking. Why don't I just marry you, Tsunade, Satsuki, and Mikoto? It's probably only a matter of time for those two since they're the last loyal Sharingan wielders. Kushina and Kimiko both just stared at him. His mother looked, well, dumbfounded. She taught him to do whatever it takes to protect his family. If he had to marry them to protect them, why wouldn't he? And you'd be okay with marrying your own mother. You know they'd want kids eventually, right? Kushina asked with a serious look on her face. Though, he could feel what could be described as a feeling of happiness coming from Kushina. If it meant that you didn't have to marry some random man you don't love, then yes, I'd be fine with it, Naruto said as he fiddled with his fingers. All of you mean the world to me, and I do love all of you. Though, I could see if you didn't want to. Incest wasn't exactly smiled upon in their world anymore. Besides bloodline clans practicing it, it was actually frowned upon. His declaration may have sounded strange coming from a 10-year-old, but he meant every word. He'd do whatever it took to protect them. Kushina looked at him with a stone-cold facade on her face. Though, he could feel the apprehension, surprise, and eventual joy at his declaration. A smile made its way onto her face as she let out a sigh of relief. There was one unhappy person in the room, though. What he felt from Kimiko was a little surprising to him. The older woman had a sense of loneliness and longing from her. Naruto couldn't recall feeling any passionate feelings towards him from Kimiko. Though, he just figured that she was probably just hiding it really well. Hell, she was where he got the idea to bottle up all his emotions from. I could marry Kimiko too. Just to help appease the elders, Naruto added as he looked at Kimiko. A surge of joy came from Kimiko as she quickly pulled her mask over her face. He smiled at how she attempted to hide her blush. For the first time that day, the Uzumaki household was filled with laughter. Naruto knew that life was going to get very, very complicated from here. Though, come all the hardships and joyous experiences that the future held for them. He'd face all of it and persevere. Crouching on the large branch of a tree in the training ground, Naruto took in deep breaths as quietly as he could. His violet eyes were searching the woods around him for a certain blonde, who was currently trying to kill him, it felt like. The ground quaked suddenly as the tree he was on lurched forward, followed by most of the other trees surrounding him. With the added agility of his constant training, Naruto leapt off the tree and narrowly avoided the falling logs around him. Once his feet landed on the dirt below, he looked up and focused his chakra as he noticed a tree falling towards him. While he could get out of the way with relative ease, he wanted to test his ability. Focusing, Naruto summoned forth his chakra as a golden shield to prevent the tree from falling on him. Smiling, he stepped to the side as he deactivated his ability. Though, the hairs on his neck quickly stood up on edge as he searched the area around him. Whether it was because he had a gut feeling or not, Naruto turned to the left and saw a busty blonde rushing towards him. You've left yourself wide open. Tsunade shouted as she threw a chakra-enhanced punch towards Naruto. He couldn't dodge due to just how fast Tsunade was, so he opted to summon a minimum of 3 chakra shields. His eyes narrowed, and he ground his teeth as he heard and felt the first 2 shields shatter entirely due to Tsunade's sheer power. Before she could destroy the last one, he attempted to gain some ground. Summoning multiple chakra blades around him. With the flick of his hand, Naruto sent them all barreling towards Tsunade. The blonde didn't even flinch at the hailstorm of blades headed her way as she simply grabbed a fallen log and used it as a shield. Meanwhile, Naruto was attempting to get some ground between himself and the Senju princess. He knew it was futile to engage in combat with her at close range. Most idiots knew that, so, for the past couple of hours or so, he had spent his time trying not to die. At first, he had engaged Tsunade head-on, though Naruto had quickly found it very fast that he most definitely didn't want to do that. The woman had easily shrugged off or dodged most of his attacks, and she crushed most of his defenses with ease. The difference in both skill and experience was quite blatant. After all, Tsunade had fought in the Second Shinobi War and had been trained by Hiruzen Sarutobi. The woman had the know-how and strength to destroy most of her enemies. There wasn't a doubt in Naruto's mind that she was likely one of the strongest people he knew. Summoning even more blades and various other weapons, Naruto pointed at Tsunade, beckoning all of them forth as they pelted the log. With his consistent barrage, the hardwood slowly began chipping away. Upon impact, his chakra weapons disappeared due to running out of the amount of chakra stored in them being replenished. Though, the damage remained. Eventually, due to the log being practically destroyed, Tsunade chucked the remnants of it towards Naruto. She grinned as she punched the ground. The earth crumbled, causing the red-haired brat to fall into the chasm. Leaping into the hole into the ground, Tsunade grabbed Naruto and picked him up out of the dirt. Setting him down on his feet, she watched with a smile as he grumpily dusted off his clothing. He had definitely improved from their last training segment. Hell, he better have. After all, unlike most people, Naruto was blessed with the mere fact he was being trained by 4 kunoichi, all of which were powerful in their own regard. Though, for now, she was the strongest out of all of them. Now for a majority of people, having so many teachers would cause issues. Primarily if said teachers were all conflicting with one another's teachings. So, Tsunade and the other women had all agreed to teach and train Naruto on certain months. You're doing pretty well for someone who's just fixing to graduate from the academy, Tsunade complimented as Naruto grumbled at her. And for a granny, you can still kick my around like nothing, Naruto said, causing Tsunade to hit him on the head. I deserved that, he said as they both climbed out of the hole. Yeah, you did, brat, Tsunade grumbled out as she smiled at Naruto, who was rubbing his head. I'll go get lunch. Why don't you rest for a bit? She told the red-haired brat, who nodded eagerly. Naruto couldn't help himself as he watched as Tsunade walked away from him. The way those dark bluish pants hugged her curves had his teenage hormones going haywire, along with her sleeveless gray blouse, which her massive S strained against. Throughout the fight, he had issues with getting distracted by her assets. Rolling his shoulders, Naruto walked over to a tree, untouched by the destruction that had racked the training ground. Letting out a grunt, Naruto practically collapsed against the tree. The shade was absolutely refreshing, and it already felt 10 degrees cooler. It was a humid and hot day, though not entirely unbearable. Feeling his body already begin to ache, Naruto groaned. Tsunade's training always left him rather sore. That woman did not know the meaning of holding back. Though, he couldn't refute that her training was beneficial. At first, he was extremely hesitant on their first spar. Tsunade was a powerful woman, and he knew that, though she had told him to come at her with intent to kill. He wasn't entirely comfortable with it, but after the whopping she gave him, he knew that he was far away from being able to hurt her. Taking in a deep breath, Naruto relaxed against the tree. A gust of wind blew through the training ground, bringing a refreshing, cool breeze. The last 5 years had been long and harsh. So much had happened. The elders of the village were quite glad to hear what he had to say when he spoke to them. A half-blooded Uzumaki taking on 5 wives, a Senju, 2 Uchihas, an Uzumaki, and a powerful Jonin of the village. What more could they ask for? They had even gone so far as to tell the villagers what happened, thinking it was a good idea at the time. Safe to say that it wasn't. Once the villagers had heard of how the CRA was enforced on the Senju princess, the last 2 remaining loyal Uchihas, and his mother. There had been riots and strikes all throughout the Land of Fire. Mikoto, Kushina, and Tsunade were all respected in their own rights. For them to be forced into a marriage for the sole purpose of creating soldiers wasn't something the villagers were too keen on. Supposedly, some civilian villages had even begun hiring other ninja, not affiliated with Konoha. Whether that was true or not, he didn't know. Either way, it was interesting to hear about. Many of them had begun demanding the resignations of whoever brought the idea forth. And while Konoha, much like the other villages, was practically a military dictatorship, the calls for resignation and strikes in the civilian workforce had begun affecting everyone. It had gotten to the point where the daimyo of the Land of Fire had finally agreed with the people and demanded the resignations of the parties involved. So, both of the village advisors, Homura and Kaharu, resigned. The riots and strikes ceased immediately, and all was well. Everyone went back to work, thinking everything had been solved. The villagers were ignorant that the CRA hadn't even been revoked from the 4 women. That had actually blown his mind at the time, regardless of age. And it continued to blow his mind to this very day. How these people all of a sudden became passive and reverted back to their everyday lives from the simple resignation of 2 advisors, was absolutely mind-blowing. It really spoke volumes to Naruto and just how ignorant the villagers were. His training in the last 5 years had also progressed well. He did have both Kimiko, Tsunade, Mikoto, and Kushina training both him and Satsuki. The 4 women were ruthless with their various regimes, but it was all for his betterment, and he loved it. Kushina had helped him with the ability he awoken on that day. She had realized it was similar to her chains, at least in terms of durability and strength. Though, unlike her adamantine chains, he was able to create damn near whatever he wanted with it. Naruto just let out a sigh as he looked up. His entire life had been altered on that fateful evening with Azane now that he thought about it. Because of her actions, he now had to take 5 women, one of whom was his mother, as his wives. He shook his head from side to side to help rid his thoughts of Azane. Instead, he opted to think of the 5 women he now had in his life and how they changed in the last 5 years. He let out a sigh as he stared at the sky above. Time flew by like nothing. Kushina, Kimiko, Tsunade, and Mikoto had all remained quite the same appearance-wise. Their constant training kept them all in shape. Satsuki, on the other hand, had changed entirely. She was now a stunning young woman with long jet black hair and a gorgeous face. Satsuki was by far the most troublesome to deal with out of all of them. Rightfully so, with all the emotional trauma that Azane had inflicted upon her. The moment she was out of her coma-like state, she wanted to go after Azane. She wanted revenge for her slain kin and to seek answers from her elder sister. Thankfully he, along with the others, had managed to talk her out of that. The healing process for both her and Mikoto was slow, but it happened day by day. His relationship with her had always been strange, even more so during her recovery. He made sure to be there for her when he could to give her his support. Satsuki had always been hesitant about depending on anyone, and Azane's betrayal had only made that even worse. Though, after countless reassurances and his promise to her that he'd be there for her no matter what, did she finally begin opening up to him again. His relationship with Mikoto was just as strange. She was still dealing with the fallout of her clan's massacre when she learned that he planned on marrying her. His proposal had left her in a weird state. She had always been affectionate towards him, but after she had learned of his plans, that had changed somewhat as she was much more distant. Once he explained to her that it was only a means to protect her from the CRA, was she alright with it? And now, he had quite the mess on his hands. After a couple of months, she became much more affectionate with him. She'd sneak kisses and hold hands with him constantly. When there wasn't anyone around, she'd do everything to gain his attention. Thankfully, there was Kimiko to balance his abnormal relationships. The silver-haired woman had changed somewhat. She was much happier now, and their relationship progressed quite steadily. She was not afraid nor shy to say just how ecstatic she was about their eventual marriage. No longer was Kimiko just dwelling and depressed about the past. She now looked forward to something in the future. Seeing her now never ceased to make him smile. Then there was his mother. Kushina was still on the fence on where their relationship laid from what he knew. First and foremost, she was his mother, but he had technically married her with the same goal of protecting her. Though, like Kimiko, she was much happier now. After leaving the Anbu, she had much more time to spend with him, and they both took full advantage of that. It had been somewhat awkward at first, mainly due to the fact that they'd eventually be husband and wife. Though, they both just reveled in one another's company. He'd never seen her smile as much as she did now that she left the Anbu. Hopefully, he'd managed to keep her smiling. Then there was Tsunade. Their relationship was weird, to say the least. She was old enough to be his grandmother and could probably kick his with ease. Thankfully, she had a sweet spot for family, just like she did for Sake. While she wasn't entirely thrilled with their given predicament, she wasn't against it. Tsunade had told him that she'd seen countless things in her life, and this would just be added to the list. If anything, it seemed like she really didn't care about it all that much. Though, after a long, harsh training session one evening a couple of months ago, Tsunade had taken him out for dinner. She had said it was necessary to unwind after all the training they had done. He had figured it was just another excuse for her to order some sake to enjoy with their food. The older woman even slipped him a couple of shots regardless of his age. He still wasn't considered an adult since he hadn't graduated from the academy. Though, that didn't stop him from drinking any, nor did anyone try to prevent him from drinking. After all, who would stop the Senju princess from enjoying her sake? Absolutely no one would. It was his first time getting drunk, and it wasn't as great as people talked it up to be. The alcoholic beverages were alright, though nothing like expected. The more he drank, the better it tasted, and soon both he and Tsunade were drunk. The blonde Senju and Naruto were drunk in a couple of hours, and he learned quite a lot of things about her then. First off, Tsunade was a very bipolar drunk. That woman could go from being extremely relaxed to wanting to tear out someone's throat or crying her heart out. She was also much more talkative with him regarding just about anything, along with being even more brutally honest and blunt than usual. Tsunade was typically quite cordial with him, given the fact he was Kushina's only son. He was used to her being quite doting on him. Though on that night, Tsunade was anything but cordial with him. She had pointed out so many things she found wrong with how he approached things. She had admitted that she was infuriated with how he acted regarding his attitude before the incident. The way he moped around like some lost dog instead of actually putting in more effort into changing was something that drove her mad. He felt strange being chastised by her but listened nonetheless. She was right on most accounts. Though, when she told him just how proud she was that he was changing, it made him happy. It made him feel even weirder being chastised by a woman who was now his wife, along with being very prominent in his early life. There was one thing that was bothering him somewhat. Tsunade was only talking about him. She hadn't really talked about her adult life all too much, so he started asking a couple of questions. Tsunade's jovial mood had taken a complete turnaround. The smile quickly faded off of her face, and she now looked somber. She just glanced at him before ordering another bottle of sake. Even drunk, he knew her past was a sensitive topic that she didn't like to talk about at all, yet he still brought it up. He was about to apologize and either shut his mouth or change the topic entirely. Though Tsunade merely just waved off his apologies as he hung his head in shame. The older woman merely had some more sake before she let out a huge sigh. Maybe it was because she was finally comfortable enough with him, he didn't know, but Tsunade finally talked about her tragic past for the first time with him. From there, he recalled just sitting there quiet as Tsunade let out all of her feelings. She was much calmer than he expected as she told him of all the things that happened. That didn't mean he didn't see and feel the sadness and regret wafting off the woman. Her hands began shaking, and he saw the tears well in her eyes as she talked about Dan and Nawaki. It was a little awkward for him to hear about her previous lover, but he continued to let her vent. By the time she was done, Tsunade was letting the tears fall freely from her face. He was taught that showing emotion as a ninja was to show weakness. Yet, here was one of the strongest people he knew, bawling her eyes out. It helped him realize that even though shinobi were trained killers, they were human at the end of the day. Naruto couldn't stand to see the sight of someone he held dear to his heart crying, so he got up from where he was sitting and sat next to her. He gingerly put an arm around her shoulder since he half expected Tsunade to recoil away from him. Count him surprised when she actually leaned into his hug. After crying for at least 30 minutes, Tsunade finally relaxed. She thanked him for listening to her rant with a smile. Maybe it was the alcohol along with his raging teenage hormones, but the way she smiled at him made his heart race. From that point forward in the evening, he really started looking at Tsunade as a woman. The way she looked happy as she drank even more sake with a smile, her hazel brown eyes were full of glee now. Her long, blonde hair that was tied into separate pigtails flowed over his arms. And last but not least, Tsunade had deemed it to be too hot and had taken off her green haori and adjusted her gray blouse, inadvertently showing off her large S. By Kami, he practically drank in the sight like he drank the sake that night. From that point in the evening, his memory was spotty. He recalled them leaving the restaurant with bottles of sake in their hands as they painted the town red and enjoyed the night together. Despite his lapses of memory, he could remember having some of the most fun he'd ever had in his life that evening. Though, when he woke up the next day in an unfamiliar bed with a slight headache, he was filled with unease. His heart had practically dropped in his chest, but he relaxed when he realized it was Tsunade. He had adjusted the sheets some, and his heart had sunk in his chest once more. Both he and Tsunade were wearing their birthday suits. Tsunade had woken up just a couple of minutes after he did, and she turned and warily looked at him with her hazel brown eyes. The woman blinked a couple times as she looked at him. He was positive he looked like an idiot with the blush that was on his face. Then the woman let out a yawn as she stretched, not even bothering to try and hide her bountiful tits capped with puffy pink nipples. While he appreciated the sight, the blood soon rushed back to his brain, and his heart began racing. His first thought was that he probably lost his virginity. He hung his head in shame and embarrassment when he realized he was blackout drunk and didn't remember anything. Meanwhile, Tsunade had got out of bed and gave him a clear view of her entire body. She didn't utter a word as she poured 2 cups of water. The woman drank the clear water before moving over to where her clothes were on the floor. Watching that woman bend over and flash him her goods had his blood rushing away from his brain. After putting on his shirt, which most definitely did not fit her, Tsunade walked back over to the bed as she sat down beside him. He would never forget just how aroused he felt seeing a woman wear his clothes. After a very awkward talk, mainly from his end, Tsunade had explained to him that he better get used to waking up with a woman in his bed due to his position. Never in his life would he forget the devious smile that she flashed him as she told him of their escapades in the bedroom. She had described to him in very vivid detail of everything they'd done to one another. Suffice to say that he had discovered a very different part of Tsunade that morning. That morning and the previous evening were quite eventual, Naruto recalled with a smile as he leaned his head against the tree. Their relationship has changed drastically ever since then. Tsunade was much more upfront with her issues, and he'd be there to help her through all of it. Just like the rest of the women who were now in his life. He'd be more than happy to help her get through anything. His tense shoulders began to relax as Naruto adjusted his body, resting his head on his arm. He could feel his eyelids getting heavy as his breathing evened out. Before long, he was asleep. Kushina let out a drawn-out sigh as she stared at the reflection in the water of the sink. She pouted as she looked at noticeably shorter hair as she ran her hand through it. Instead of the flowing mane of red hair she had throughout her teen and adult life, it was now more or less of a bob cut. After an unfortunate training accident with Mikoto and Satsuki involving a couple fire jutsu, her long red tresses were gone. She only had it as she did now for a couple reasons. Mainly because of Naruto's constant compliments, and it helped her feel more connected to her family. Though, looking on the bright side, at least her hair was all she left. Training accidents typically left most shinobi either dead or seriously wounded regarding the severity of the injury. Missing some hair was most definitely preferable. Mikoto and Satsuki had apologized profusely, but there really wasn't any changing what happened. Speaking of the two Uchihas, she sensed them coming home before they clambered inside from the back door. Looking up from the sink, she flashed a quick smile at the sweating and exhausted Uchiha duo. Drying her hands, she created a couple of clones to begin cooking dinner. The clones would do most of the housework, so she opted to relax on the sofa. Her household was much busier than it had ever been 5 years ago. With 5 extra people living here now, it was much more hectic, and she found herself missing the calm, quiet atmosphere from before. The whole act of having 5 other women in her house took some getting used to. At first, it was a hectic mess having 5 different personalities all clashing against one another. It didn't help that except for one of them, they were all grown women, so they all had a peculiar way of doing things. Though, after the first shaky month of getting their shit together, she found herself enjoying their presence despite it being a bit rowdy at times. Movie nights were always something she looked forward to, along with dinner at night. Now it was almost like a constant sleepover, except everyone took turns doing chores or cooking. Kushina snorted at the childish thought of it being a sleepover. A smile quickly overtook her face because of how accurate it was. Despite all of the things and funny accidents that happened in the last 5 years, she found it strange that they were all so happy. That was probably due to the constant efforts of a certain redhead, who they were all technically married to. Even though he was constantly being trained or training, Naruto still managed to find some time to spend with them. He also made sure to have time set aside for them and was determined to make them happy. As her thoughts drifted to her not-so-little son, a myriad of emotions bloomed in Kushina's chest. Naruto had shot up over the years. The last time she had checked, he stood over her at around 5 feet, 10 inches. All of the training he was being put through was doing wonders for his body. Instead of inheriting his father's slender frame, Naruto's body was rippling with muscles. A blush quickly adorned Kushina's face as she squirmed her legs together as an all-too-familiar heat bloomed in her. She'd seen incestuous relationships before in her life, though she never expected to be in one herself. Contrasting feelings of repulsiveness, genuine attractions, and motherly feelings coursed through her as she thought of Naruto. Naruto's natural charisma, along with being very thoughtful and sweeter, made it hard not to develop feelings for him. Whenever he was spending the day with her, he made sure to make her his sole focus, no matter the situation. With Minato, she was too busy just listening to him talk about all the issues in the village. She felt more like an advisor than a wife. That wasn't the case with her son, not one bit. On their date nights, she was subjected to his constant compliments on her outfits, hair, and the very little makeup she wore. Their relationship felt real, and he was open to talking about any of her issues. Kushina let out another long sigh as she cuddled into the recliner. She really needed to stop comparing Naruto to Minato. They were two separate people. One was still alive and supporting her, while the other was dead and had betrayed her trust. Why does it always need to be so difficult? Kushina muttered to herself as her thoughts continued to linger on Naruto. Her only issue was that Naruto was her child, and she was attracted to him. In other cultures, even her clan had practiced incest. One part of her mind argued that it didn't matter. Even if he was related to her, she should love him. While the other more rational part of her mind was still on the fence, pleading to preserve their mother-son relationship. Another, much more frustrated sigh left Kushina as she adjusted herself on the recliner and stared at the ceiling above. She hated and loved that Naruto was probably the only person for her, all things considered. She knew for a fact that he was infinitely better than marrying someone the Hokage deemed fitting for her. Sensing the redhead who continued to plague her thoughts, fast approaching, Kushina leaned forward from her recliner. Adjusting her blue sweatpants and sleeveless blue shirt, she smiled when she heard the door open. Naruto soon came into the living room, his gray t-shirt and dark blue sweatpants drenched in sweat. Oni-chan must have done a number on you, huh? Kushina asked as Naruto took a seat on the sofa beside her. With him being so close, Kushina could easily smell his natural scent, which was only intensified by his sweat. That ever so familiar heat returned between her legs as she crossed her legs tightly. 15 years was a long time. Yeah, she doesn't know how to hold back. Just like you, Naruto said with a teasing smile as he enjoyed the air conditioning of their house. Idiot, Kushina indignantly replied as she turned to look away from her attractive son. Realizing she didn't sense Tsunade come back with him, she returned her gaze to Naruto. Where'd Oni-chan run off to? She and Shizune went to the hot springs after training, Naruto hastily answered as he squirmed under Kushina's narrowed eyes. Tsunade hadn't broached their relationship all too subtly to the rest of the household, screaming at the top of her lungs one evening. Kushina let out a displeased hmph as anger and that aching heat followed by jealousy coursed through her at his answer. She wasn't born yesterday. She knew exactly where they were doing after their training. She was uncomfortable with the fact that Naruto was sleeping with the woman that was his godmother. Yeah, she wasn't even capable of convincing herself. She was jealous and upset that Tsunade was getting action that she hadn't gotten in 15 years. She tried to discreetly wriggle her legs tightly against one another as her baby boy had the decency to look guilty. That wasn't something she was entirely on board with. Sharing her soon-to-be husband was something she most definitely did not want to do. Uzumaki didn't do well with sharing anything, much less their spouse. Though, it wasn't like she or Naruto had much of a choice. Are you two, at least being safe with each other? Kushina asked, doing her best to hide her obvious arousal and displeasure. I think we are, Naruto sheepishly answered as he rubbed the back of his head nervously. Lying to the people he loved was something he would never do. That's good to hear, Kushina said, letting out a sigh of relief as she closed her eyes. Then her brain processed what Naruto said and not what she wanted to hear. Her eyes narrowed with barely concealed anger as she turned her furious gaze back on her baby boy. What did you just say? Naruto just smiled at Kushina as a pout was emblazed on her face. Just the way her cheeks were red with anger. Never in his life would he have thought he'd see his mom as cute when she was angry. Are you jealous? Naruto asked with barely hidden amusement, ignoring his mother's question. His smile was still in place as he leaned forward to watch Kushina's reaction. Of course I'm not. Kushina shouted with a full-on blush adorning her cheeks before she got up and stormed out of the room. Hearing his laughter only edged her anger and jealousy further as she ran up the stairs. Ignoring the glares of spite and jealousy, Naruto walked beside Satsuki. There weren't many people on the street this early, thankfully. After his run-in all those years ago, he wasn't too keen on interacting with the people of Konoha. Though, his focus was diverted to the ravenet at his side. Turning to look at her, he smiled at how the early light made her creamy white skin glow. Those long black tresses framed her face on both sides. A stray lock of hair fell over her nose and slightly obscured the vision of her left eye.